For my author study, I chose to analyze scholars' thoughts on Charles Chesnutt and his Uncle Julius stories. I chose this because throughout the semester, I have not only enjoyed them the most, but I feel that these stories taught me the most about literary analysis. Today, I am going to talk about what I have learned from these three scholarly sources, each pertaining to a different story, and how they have better shaped my understanding of the purpose of said stories. First, I am going to talk about Poe Sandy and its lessons on culture, memory, and historical amnesia. I am then going to discuss the Goophered Grapevine and its purpose as a social criticism. And lastly, I will finish with a discussion of Dave's Neckliss and its interesting association with the Curse of Ham. In On Flags of Fraternities, Lessons on Cultural Memory and Historical Amnesia in Charles Chesnutt's Poe Sandy, written by Margaret D. Bauer, she talks about how any symbol of the Old South cannot strictly represent the romantic side of the time period and how Poe Sandy reinforces this idea. Bauer brings to light that due to the popular genre of romantic plantation fiction during this time, Annie most likely wants the new kitchen to play out some sort of Old South fantasy. Personally, I never thought of this connection when first reading Poe Sandy. Surprisingly enough, after Uncle Julius shares the story about Sandy, Annie still wants the new kitchen. Bauer writes, Annie has apparently missed another motivation Julius has in telling these stories, which is not only to deconstruct myths about slavery, but also to de-romanticize the Old South in its entirety. I think that this is a super important point to realize and poses the question of whether or not Chesnutt employed too many outs for the reader. By making the story so unrealistic to try and convey the real hard truth, he may have lost some of his readers along the way. By Sandy being nothing but a tree that was cut down, it has the potential to leave the reader unbothered and not in a position of reflection. Bauer then relates the kitchen separate from the house to the Confederate flag, as well as a Southern fraternity tradition. Just as Annie still wanted the kitchen after hearing the horrors of slavery, people still showcased the Confederate flag after the Civil War. College students still have or had Confederate balls. Chesnutt wrote the Uncle Julius stories after Reconstruction as he knew the Confederate way of life has not ended. He knew more change had to be made. Bauer wraps up with an impressive piece of writing that says, one cannot evoke the moonlight and magnolias and turn a deaf ear to the moanin' and groanin'. I now gain a strong sense that Chesnutt's aim was not to denounce slavery, but was instead to denounce the disacknowledgement of slavery. His aim was to highlight that the people today who do not participate in the ridicule of oppression are just as bad as the oppressors themselves. For example, the people who wave Confederate flags and the students who throw Confederate-themed balls with the claim that they are simply showing harmless support to the romantic side of the time period. Coming full circle, it is clear to me why Bauer feels strongly about how any Old South symbol cannot just represent one side of things. To them, it may be all smiles and good times, but to others, they recognize what those symbols represent and are disappointed that people are still naive enough to showcase it. Now that I have talked about Poe Sandy, I'm going to move into Chesnutt's The Goophered Grapevine. In Chesnutt's The Goophered Grapevine as Social Criticism by Theodore R. Hovet, he talks about how Chesnutt's piece critiques American society and demonstrates the consequences of American imperialism. Due to this imperialist mindset, both nature and African Americans were exploited during this time period in order to satisfy the greed of plantation owners. Hovet writes, man's direct contact with nature has been severed. Even more catastrophically, once severed from nature, man turns against man. In order to exploit nature, he must exploit the worker. It is important to recognize that slavery was created due to Americans' greed and their want to turn crops into money. Julius' story showcases how the severed relationship with nature evolves into a severed relationship between man by showing Henry's conversion into a commodity himself. Hovet goes on to write, Julius intuitively grasps that the cycle of exportation will begin again with the appearance of the Yankee. Julius tells his tale of the Goophered Grapevine in order to warn the Northerner of the consequences of industrial development. Just as Bauer's analysis of Poe Sandy recognized a sort of historical amnesia, Hovet seems to be identifying the same thing. The Northerner does not care much for Julius' story and purchases the vineyard anyways. The Northerner's ignorance has turned him into a hypocrite, as he is about to participate in the same acts that they so passionately work to prevent. The only difference this time being that Julius has a wage. Hovett brings to light a quote from Chesnutt's story that says, "Don't let us disturb you. There is plenty of room for all." He goes on to demonstrate that there is not plenty of room. There is only room when there is opportunity for economic power and advancement. Through Hovett's work, I find that the Goophered Grapevine is a critique of society in more than one way. It definitely serves to showcase the horrors of slavery and educate people at this time of what it was like to be dehumanized. It allowed the reader to get a to, it allowed the reader to gain a small sense of what it was like to be an African American pre-Civil War. Alone, this purpose is great, but I think that more can be taken from the story. It serves as a reminder on the consequences of selfishness, of greed, of exploitation. It shows that economic prosperity is no excuse for severing the relationship between man. With technology and industrialization ever increasing during this time period, and even today, it works to eradicate ignorance and hopes to create everlasting effect. Now that I have discussed the Goophered Grapevine, I will conclude with a study regarding Chesnutt's Dave's Neckliss. In Out of the Realm of Superstition, Chesnutt's Dave's Neckliss and the Curse of Ham by John N. Swift and Gigan Mamazur, they write about how, along with its purpose to serve anti-slavery, it also has strong meaning regarding the African American's Christian identity. In Dave's Neckliss, Chesnutt takes a different approach when it comes to his Uncle Julius tales. Here, we see a more realistic approach as the character change is purely psychological rather than physical. Like Henry and Sandy, Swift and Mamazur explain how Chesnutt uses satire to shed light on a serious topic, being the relationship between Christianity and racism during this time period. They do this by talking about the Curse of Ham, or otherwise known as Noah's Curse. The Curse of Ham, put briefly, is a biblical story that permanently assigned Ham and his descendants to be servants to his two brothers and their descendants, Shem and Japheth. They write, put simply, slave owners could and did claim divine intention for the servile status of their slaves. People used this biblical story to justify their actions against African Americans, as they interpreted it as saying African Americans are the said descendants or sons of Ham. The involvement of the Curse of Ham when analyzing this story extends its political reach as it implicates the debate regarding Southern white Christianity in slavery. After reading this scholarly article, it got me thinking about how Dave had a decent level of biblical literacy in the story, and how his master allowed him to share this knowledge. But this was only because Dave claimed that the Bible taught him to obey his master. The authors go on to write, not liberation at all, but the rationalization of one's chains. Chesnutt here presents a sardonic historical diagnosis, not too far from that of his contemporary Nietzsche. And when the fairy tale fails, when human desire for Ham or for Dilsey tears the veil of Christian submissiveness, another face of religion, the invidious racism of Noah's curse itself binds Dave's black body, its blackness, the inescapably visible mark of its ordained and essential servitude, in more literal shackles. I now recognize that Chesnutt is sending a warning against the idea of embracing an identity of outcast or being okay with an inferior status. The story of Dave represents the oppressive nature of embracing that identity and the tragedy that results from it. Chesnutt showcases how a person can become delusional and forget that they are human too. After analyzing these three scholarly sources and reevaluating the meaning of the three Uncle Julius stories, I must admit that I did not fully grasp all they had to offer when I first analyzed them. These scholars helped me immensely to think deeper and create connections across these works and others. Chesnutt is an extremely impressive author, and I am glad I was able to learn more about him and his writing style, as it is clear that he worked hard to use his gift to bring betterment to society.